Coming up, as the Prime Minister pretended to paint in a Churchillian manner during his recent £25,000 holiday in Marbella, paid for no doubt by a cash for favours donor, the British economy was bouncing from crisis to crisis. And it's not just a dysfunctional economy, it's a dysfunctional Brexit delivered by a dysfunctional government, which in turn was delivered by a dysfunctional political system. Let's take a closer look. I really do wonder what it must be like right now to be a member of the inner cabal in control at Westminster, knowing full well that responsibility lies with you and your boss for the current state of post-Brexit Britain. The shortages in the shops continue many weeks after the pingdemic was being blamed as the culprit. The bodies are literally piling high, to quote Boris V, as thousands of dead pigs and other livestock, which the broken supply chain can't cope with, are slaughtered and sent to rendering plants. And if you're thinking this is just another Brexit teething problem, it'll all come right in the end, then ask yourself this. If you were a pig farmer, or maybe some of you watching this video are pig farmers, are you likely to invest capital on rearing another batch of piglets for market next year or the year after? Meanwhile, Christmas shortages loom as ships from Asia are diverted from Felixstowe and other UK ports to ports within the EU like Rotterdam because there are no drivers in Britain to transport the cargo once it's offloaded. At the same time, because Lordy David Frost and his carer Boris Johnson are now admitting that they had no intention of honouring their commitment and ratification of the Northern Ireland Protocol, the EU are beginning preparations for a trade war with Britain. And that's not all. Another crisis is playing out in terms of gas prices, with the UK being far more reliant on this fossil fuel than most countries in the EU. But don't worry, the Business Secretary Kwasi Kwarteng, who by the way has a spectacular lack of experience in anything business related, has a plan. He's planning for a wet, windy and mild winter to help us through the fuel crisis. Get the wind turbines cranking and all will be well, he postulates. And all this with a background of COVID rates that for a couple of days last week saw the UK record more new COVID infections than any other country in the world. Truly world-beating, to coin a phrase. Yet we see this government covering their ears and yelling blah 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 as loudly as they can whenever a pandemic expert mentions that perhaps mandating masks in public places might not be a bad idea. How far British standards of governance have fallen under this regime. And where was Johnson as these multiple crises unfolded? In Marbella for his, 15th holiday of 2021? And why shouldn't he? Despite the dysfunctional Brexit and its catastrophic implications for the economy and for civic life in Britain as a whole, the Tories continue to lead in the polls. Partly due to Sandy Bollocks de Pfeffel's admittedly clever optimistic narrative with a positive spin on everything from job vacancies to 5p off a bottle of New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, but also due to the frustratingly weak leadership of Keir Starmer in the Labour Party. The Brexit cabal must laugh their way through cabinet meetings, having to pinch themselves to believe how easily they're getting away with disaster after disaster. But surely the more intelligent ones, like the Slithy Gove and Shifty Sunak, must realise that at some point it will all end in tears, because when all's said and done, whatever the effects of COVID and supply chain issues that are to varying extents making themselves felt globally, in Britain there remains lurking at the back of the room the elephant known as Brexit. The fact is, Brexit was a monumental act of recklessness and misplaced nationalism which has led to major consequences for society and the economy. And now Brexit itself is unravelling as the government is instigating patch-up measures to partially get Brexit undone. The genie is out of the bottle, and it seems to most neutral commentators that the days of the United Kingdom itself are numbered. Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP in overwhelmingly Remain voting Scotland have every right to demand a rerun of the original independence referendum, where the No to Independence voters were promised a Scottish future within the EU. In Northern Ireland, it appears that apart from a small but very vocal minority within the Unionist parties, the Northern Irish population as a whole quite like the continuing membership of the EU Customs Union, with many traditionally loyalist voters now contemplating support for a united Ireland if it provides continued membership of the EU. But for the rest of the UK, England and Wales, there is a dawning realisation, tiny step by tiny step, that perhaps the sunlit uplands populated by unicorns crapping out rainbows was actually just a big con perpetrated by the Leave camp prior to the 2016 advisory referendum. I've come to realise that there isn't one big turning point that will make Leave voters face up to the folly of the Brexit decision, but that it will come about by the death of 1,000 cuts. We approach ever nearer to a watershed moment where the catastrophe of Brexit becomes undeniable. This is why rumours are growing of the Tories looking at calling a snap election by mid-2022 before we comply with international law and Brexit import controls are actually fully implemented, which is when the fecal matter will really hit the air conditioning. To paraphrase Will Self, all racists and bigots voted for Brexit, but that doesn't mean that all Brexit voters are racists and bigots. Some on the left had genuine concerns about the EU as an obstacle to achieving renationalisation of public services and utilities, and many more voted Leave as an expression of their frustration at the dysfunctional Cameron government, the MP's expenses scandal, the pointless, murderous and expensive Iraq war of the Blair government, and years of Tory austerity. The day Cameron spaffed millions on a leaflet sent to every UK household urging them to vote to remain in the EU, that was the day I started worrying about a backlash among voters and rebellious crosses in the Leave box in the advisory referendum. What didn't occur to many of those rebellious Leave voters was that the biggest champions of Brexit, Conservatives such as Johnson himself, Jacob Rees-Mogg, David Davis, Ian Duncan Smith, John Redwood and the Slithy Gove, were the very people who had supported Blair's Iraq war, Cameron's austerity policies, and were part of that group of Westminster politicians trousering huge expenses at taxpayers' cost. These Brexit champions represented something that was, to me, deeply troubling. These were the very people who were using a collapse in trust that they had contributed to champion a Brexit that's reducing trust in politicians even further. And the reason I find that so deeply troubling is that those on the right wing of British politics always seem to benefit from the very problems that they themselves create. As civic anger increases, so you can see government ministers delivering speeches with the Union Jacks in the background, creating culture wars and threatening France or Spain or Germany. And if public anger does eventually sweep Johnson away, you have to wonder what will replace him. Could be something worse. Prime Minister Pritla Patel, anyone? Billionaire austerity champion Shifty Sunak? To coin an old phrase, something must be done. We need the Labour Party to stop listening to their interminable focus groups, stop trying to hitch a ride on the wagon of populism, and stop following public sentiment and instead begin leading it. Labour MPs need to focus on this dysfunctional Brexit and start focusing on the promises that were made by Brexiteer politicians and how those promises differ from the actual reality. How being outside the EU is weakening our economy and our standing in the world, making us subject to extreme volatility in trading conditions and leaving us vulnerable to having our economic and political carcass picked clean by state and entrepreneurial vultures from China, Russia and other nations who don't have British interests at heart. If Labour can get their act together and start telling the truth about Brexit rather than trying to win back Brexit voting former Red Wall constituents, they will be on the right side of history. And with a commitment to moving us closer to Europe and to eventually persuade the EU to readmit us into the customs union and single market, perhaps Labour can get ahead of public opinion rather than just limply following behind. Whether that will ever happen under Starmer, I'm doubtful. But as Brexit turns to ashes in the mouths of Leave voters, they'll be looking for a credible alternative to the current populist, incompetent and corrupt government.